Well, hello, my name is Gary Shigenaka. I am speaking to you from the other side, which of course means that I retired at the end of 2020, but I used to work for the Emergency Response Division of NOAA in Seattle, and it was under the auspices of NOAA and ERD that we performed this work that I'm going to tell you about. So what I'd like to share with you is a little project that we did to look at the effects of oil and dispersants on whale baleen. This was a joint project. You can see in this slide here, I had a number of collaborators and co-authors, and they certainly did the hard part. I mainly observed and kicked in a little bit of money. So the brains behind this operation are the other folks that you see listed after me. So you see in this opening photograph, a whale swimming through what apparently looks like an oil slick. And I am going to return to this slide at the very end of the talk to discuss a little bit of speculation, actually a fair amount of speculation on my part, but also try to put some context around this particular slide. But I think it's a good slide to show a cetacean moving through a surface oil slick. And in fact, it shows a North Atlantic right whale, not one of the subject whales that we looked at in our study, but again, there's a reason that I'm showing this. So the North Atlantic right whale and the other white whales are closely related to the bowhead whale. You see the bowhead at the bottom of this illustration. They're in the same family, but different genus and species, but they resemble each other in a big way. And they're significant in this particular study because their baleen characteristics are similar. Here's a photograph of a bowhead whale in its Arctic habitat. And this is a photograph of a bowhead that has been harvested by the Alaska Native communities, the Inupiaq communities up on the north slope of Alaska. So the little quote that I have at the bottom of this particular picture just explains what the baleen does for the whale. It's an integral piece of feeding adaptation for the whale to filter out the food that it prefers, largely plankton, krill, or copepods. And here's some photographs from the North Slope community provided by the Department of Wildlife for the North Slope Borough. There is an annual bowhead harvest that takes place in the community of what used to be Barrow, now it's Utqiagvik. And this just illustrates some of the characteristics of bowhead baleen. On the right-hand side is one of my principal co-authors, Todd Sformo, who is a biologist with the Wildlife Department in the North Slope Borough. And there's a little bit of information about bowhead whales there in the inset. They're long-lived, greater and sometimes much greater than 100 years. And they are typical denizens of the Arctic and subarctic waters of Alaska and other areas around the Arctic. They have been a significant mainstay for food and cultural practices for the Alaskan Native communities and the other communities around that surround the Arctic. And they largely feed on these euphausid shrimps. So over the years, other people have been interested in looking at the question of whether petroleum products, oil and sometimes dispersants, affect the performance of whale baleen. As we mentioned here, whale baleen is an important feature for baleen whale feeding, and so people wondered whether whether exposure to oil or dispersants might affect the ability of baleen to filter out primary food items. So one of the earliest studies was done by Braithwaite in the early 1980s. And you can see a fairly elaborate setup here for his experiment. But again, not unlike what we wound up doing much later on. And on the right-hand side, the main conclusion from this early study by Braithwaite was that exposure to oil decreased the filtration efficiency of whale baleen by a relatively small percentage. Similarly, another pair of authors and relatively well-known whale researchers, again in the early to mid 1980s, also examined the question of the effects of oil, in this case, bunker C, which is a heavy oil, on the filtration efficiency of a couple of different types of whale baleen, from humpback and sei whales and gray whales. And Gracchi and St. Owen determined that the oil cleared fairly quickly from baleen. Within 30 minutes, 70% of the oil had moved off of the baleen, and then almost all of it was gone within 24 hours. So interestingly, in their conclusions, these two authors concluded that oil exposure would be a relatively minor impact to large cetaceans. And they concluded also, as I've highlighted here, that further research may be outweighed by the cost and the technology requirements for setting up an experiment. And they implicitly suggested that maybe it wasn't worth it to look at the question. But of course, we didn't listen to that. About 5 years ago, we went to this facility in New Jersey, which is called OHMSETT. Those of you who are familiar with other oil research studies may have heard of this facility. The acronym OHMSETT no longer applies. It used to stand for Oil and Hazardous Materials Simulated Environmental Test Tank. And that sort of explains what it is. It's a 3 million gallon test tank built exclusively for oil-related studies. It's located in Leonardo, New Jersey, on a naval weapons station. So it's a highly secured facility. When you go in to do any work here, you're greeted by members of the Navy with automatic weapons. So you know that it's serious research. It's funded through the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund, and it's operated by the Department of Interior, what we call BSEE, or the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. You can see in this photograph, I've drawn a square or a rectangle around a couple of movable bridges that span the test tank, and these can move on a rail back and forth up and down the test tank, and that simulates either ocean currents or moving through the water. Now, they typically do not do a lot of biology at OHMSETT. And I think we may have been one of the first biologically focused studies that took place at OHMSETT. And this kind of shows you the adaptations that needed to occur to make that particular research happen. On the left-hand side, you see a piece of Bowhead Baleen. At the bottom, you see basically what is gum tissue. And then the rest of the photograph shows the baleen itself, which is a keratinized, kind of like your fingernails or toenails, growth coming from the whale's mouth. And then to mount it on that movable bridge that we saw in the last slide, we had to come up with some kind of a mechanical interface. And so the good people at the good engineers at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute came up with the drawings and the design that you see here on the right-hand side. So you can see the mount, how it is affixed to the movable bridge that we used during this particular project. So a fairly elaborate and thoughtful kind of design that it really shows why it's important to have engineers who know what they're really doing. Here's a shot of the whale baleen that we used for some of the tests. It is a largely keratinized material, but there's a large component of water content in this material, about 30% actually. So we kept it soaking in seawater in the tank when we weren't actually using the baleen for experiments. And then this is what the actual mount looked like. Kind of shows you what the various pieces are. You can see that there was a turntable that the Woods Hole engineers came up with so that we could rotate the degree of exposure, the angle of exposure for the baleen. And then you see the baleen actually mounted in this interface device that was then affixed to the bridge that you saw earlier. On the right-hand side, you see the baleen in the water, in the mount. A couple of other shots. One of the Woods Hole engineers monitored the results from the interface and running the baleen through the water. In the upper right, you see a load cell, which was actually the source of the measurements that we documented during the study, and then the computer in the lower right showing just kind of actually the force that was being measured as the baleen moved through the water. So the idea was to gather a bunch of background data on the force through the water of just untreated baleen, and then once we applied oil or dispersant to see if there was any significant difference. Up until this point, I've talked about how engineers were exposed to biology for one of the few times in the work that's being done at OHMSETT. And it turns out that biologists also don't have a lot of experience working at a 3 million gallon test tank. And one of those biologists stupidly dropped his iPhone into 3 million gallons of seawater. And this was an iPhone 5S before they became waterproof. And so you can see in this shot Siri's last words before the demise of that iPhone 5S. We did a little bit of what I guess we could call adaptive management during the research, but it's more like trying to figure things out on the fly. And so we had initially thought that we would run the baleen through surface oil because that would be a reasonable way to expose the baleen to oil. And you can see on the left-hand side what that looked like. But it actually required a lot of oil. And if you think about how a whale might move through the water, it's not just moving at a fixed elevation at the surface. It is probably opening its mouth and moving up and down to try to target prey items. So we tried a couple of different ways to apply the oil because otherwise it was just exposed at that very surface level that you see on the left-hand side. So we tried painting oil, and this was North Slope crude, onto the baleen. And I think what you're looking at in the upper center is not bowhead, but we also had humpback, and we had, I think, some gray whale baleen as well. Ultimately, we decided to maximize the exposure on the baleen by filling a little quadrat there in the lower center with oil, and then moving the baleen up and down through that oil to really maximize the amount of oil that it or our hypothetical whale might encounter as it moved along the surface of the water. Here's a video of what the baleen looks like as the bridge is moving through the water at the OHMSETT facility. There's no oil, and this is an unoiled piece of baleen. So you can see those long fibers on the baleen really do cover a lot of surface area in the water. And that's how the whale feeds efficiently and effectively in filtering out those copepods and euphausids. Another shot underneath the water, and this shows a very clever application adaptation that the engineers created to apply dispersed oil. You see baleen in front there moving through dispersed oil, pre-dispersed. And then trailing behind is a device that measures the particle size in that dispersed oil cloud. And this is the kind of data that was recorded on the computer from some of those runs at different speeds. So you can see a fair amount of scatter, but some consistency in what kind of results were obtained from that load cell. So the actual results were a little bit scattered. They were kind of all over the place. You can see the two spikes in the middle there for some baleen showed that there was a fair amount of, well, there was some difference in the amount of force measured for the boom dipped and for oil at the surface, but nothing that really significantly and consistently differed from the controls where there was no oil and no dispersant in the water. So the results indicated that the various treatments of oil, both weathered oil, unweathered oil, dispersed oil, and dispersant alone, they didn't affect the drag or the force that we measured on the baleen. And this was through a bunch of different kinds of exposures. Like I said, unweathered oil, weathered oil, and that was weathered by mostly by heat, oil that was mixed with dispersant, and then dispersant, and when I say dispersant, I'm talking about Corexit 9527, the Nalco product. So there just wasn't a lot of difference. So we couldn't really conclude that oil and dispersant treatments impaired whale performance. And those kinds of results are consistent with the results that were obtained in the 1980s. I wanted to mention a semi-related study that took place a few years after we did our work, and this was done by Alexander Worth, who also participated in our study. And Alex looked at the more intimate effects on whale baleen. We actually shared the used and unused whale baleen with Alex, so it didn't go to waste. So he then looked at the physical effects of oil exposure on whale baleen and whether the actual physical characteristics of baleen were affected by exposure to oil. And in this study, they found that oil doesn't significantly affect flexibility or strength or the ability to capture particles. So you can see in the fifth conclusion from this study that they concluded there were other risks that were probably more significant to whales than the effects of oil on whale baleen. So the bottom line for us was that, or for me anyways, was that other aspects of oil and dispersant exposure may be of greater concern than the direct effects on function and physical characteristics of whale baleen. And I actually linked this to other studies that I think you're going to hear about during this conference, this seminar series. And a lot of what we learned from the Deepwater Horizon, which is what these photographs that you see here are from, really show that there were profound effects on other cetaceans, primarily dolphins, from really prolonged oil exposure. So I'm thinking that you're also going to hear about some of these dolphin-related studies, but I just wanted to show a couple of slides that indicate the real intensity of studies that took place to look at the effects of oil and oil exposure on cetaceans, and in fact, in particular in bottlenose dolphins. But there were a lot of studies that took place during the Deepwater Horizon and then in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon to look at the effects of oil on cetaceans. And in these studies that were conducted both under the damage assessment for Deepwater Horizon as well as a follow-up consortium of studies by the Consortium for Advanced Research on Marine Mammal Health Assessments. And you can see the kinds of things that were used as metrics for those studies. So really in-depth a look at dolphin health. And again, I don't want to get too much into this because I think you're going to hear about these studies during the course of the other talks, but the early findings were that oil exposure, either through ingestion or inhalation, really had some significant effects. And you can see what effects they've identified here: adrenal effects, lung injury, hepatic injury, and then maternal effects. And on the right-hand side, what that really means for the animals themselves and the population of animals that are exposed to oil. So I want to return in closing back to the first slide where I showed this image of the North Atlantic right whale in what appears to be an oil slick. And just to give you some background, I was really interested in trying to determine, well, what is this oil slick? And it looks like the animal is really right in the middle of fairly significant release. And so with the scientific support coordinator, the NOAA scientific support coordinator in New England, we went through as many oil records as we could that corresponded to the time when these photographs were taken, and really could find nothing. And we went through both NOAA records, what the Coast Guard had. We queried the people who actually took these photographs from the Center for Coastal Studies, and there was no real indication of an oil release. And so the whale people concluded that this was a natural slick of some kind. And if we step back and take a look at some of the other photographs from this same photo series, the right whale appears to be not avoiding the slick, but actually tracking the slick. So that really supports the notion that this is a natural slick that may be associated with its primary food source, which is a copepod species. And so I tried both back when we did this work and then more recently, just in preparing for this talk, to try to answer some of these questions that came to my mind. Does the primary prey of the right whale, which is a calanus copepod, does it secrete oils or excrete oils that form something that looks like an oil slick on the water surface? And if so, do the right whales use these slick as foraging cues? And so I wasn't able to get any kind of definitive answers to these first two questions. Of course, the right whales target copepods because they contain natural oils and fatty acids, and they have a lot of caloric value to the whales, which actually obviously require a fair significant amount of calories to sustain themselves. And while I did find some journal articles about foraging cues for white whales, visual cues, or maybe tactile cues as they encounter some of these zooplankton, I didn't find anything particularly relevant to the idea that they're tracking surface slicks. And so I think perhaps one of the bottom lines is that the apparent oil resistance that we encountered in our study and Alex Worth then followed up on and found in his study, the natural apparent oil resistance of baleen may be an adaptation to the inherent oiliness of their primary prey items. Because, if you are feeding on oily prey, you don't want that to be something that you don't want the feeding plates to be naturally fouled easily. So I have this list of acknowledgements. The Barrow Whaling Captains Association in Utqiagvik provided the baleen samples that we used for the study. I didn't mention that you can imagine that there was quite a journey for those baleen samples, some of which were probably, maybe 3 meters, 4 meters in length, traveling from the North Slope of Alaska to New Jersey, of all places. We also really relied on the experience of the OHMSETT engineers who really knew how to apply oil and to mount equipment to that bridge that you saw that moved through the water. Paul Schuler, who works for a cleanup co-op called Oil Spill Response Limited, really helped us out by providing dispersant, which any of you who have done any kind of research in recent years know it's very difficult to obtain access to dispersant. And Paul really helped us out at the 11th hour by providing dispersant in their stockpiles for this study. And then we funded this through NOAA and the North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife. And we obviously did the work under NIF's permits. So that's all I have. And gosh, if I was recording this live or if I was doing this live, I could take questions, but too bad, no questions. Thank you very much, though.